Hello and welcome to today's webinar. I am Trevor Smith-Miller, the Communications Manager for the Canadian Cancer Survivor Network. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. This is a continuation of our fall series for 2023. Now, if you're new to our webinar series, a little background on our group. CCSN is an organization working with cancer patients and survivors to learn about the complexity of our health system, connect with others to plan action, and act on those plans to create better outcomes and healthy survivorship. Please visit our website to find plenty of information like news, events, and of course, our webinar series. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on YouTube, and a link will be provided by the email you registered with, along with a link to the slides provided with this presentation. We will have a quick Q&A session at the end, but if you would like, put in your questions in the chat. We have a chat function on the sidebar of our screen, and we will get to those at the end of the presentation. And now to introduce our presenter. Lorraine Boyle is a former registered nurse with over 30 years of experience in the Canadian public healthcare system and biopharmaceutical industry. Today, Lorraine is the Managing Director of Case Market Access Consulting Incorporated, with a key focus with clients to ensure the patient and clinician perspective is integrated with clear and compelling clinical and economic value propositions. Yes. This approach helps support reimbursement recommendations and decision-making. Her clinical and industry experiences span sales, marketing, market access, government relations, and patient advocacy. Therapeutic areas of focus include neurology, hematology, oncology, critical care, nephrology, and more recently, several rare disease therapies. So without any further ado, I am going to put it over to Lorraine for her talk, The Importance of Patient Input into Pharmaceutical Product Reviews and Decision-Making in Canada.
Excellent. Thank you, Trevor. And thank you to the CCSN for the opportunity to present to your network today. And I'm just going to talk a little bit, first of all, about healthcare in Canada generally. So this is a bit of a high-level discussion, very brief. Then we'll talk about the pathway to treatment availability, health technology assessment, which many in the audience will probably be familiar with, or commonly known as HTA. Then we'll discuss some current challenges that have been observed with HTA reviews, and these are observations that I have noted over the past several years working in this space, as well as factors that have been critical to successful recommendation outcomes. We'll also talk a little bit about some of the issues that have arisen for unsuccessful recommendation outcomes. So just to start off with healthcare in Canada overall, just a reminder too that the delivery of healthcare services in Canada are publicly funded through hospitals or healthcare centers. And in the outpatient space, you have clinics which are public and private. The mechanisms of healthcare delivery, as we're all aware too, is face-to-face healthcare professional engagement with patients. And there's been a growth, most notably since COVID, of virtual consultations and care. Now, healthcare funding in Canada has been described by the Canadian Medical Association with recent stats for 2022 that the majority, 70% of services are publicly funded. More than 50% of that goes to a combination of hospitals, drugs, and physicians. Now let's drill down a little bit more to pharma and biotech public funding. There could be some provincial funding, but mainly the public funding routes are through the provincial jurisdictions. This includes your provincial specific drug programs or plans like the Ontario Provincial Drug Program or BC Pharmacare Program, just to name a couple. But there is some private insurance available via Manulife and Sun Life of the world. And depending on the therapeutic area, there'll be a public or private funding proportion, which varies. And you'll sometimes hear individuals speaking about a public-private split. And that's where there's a discussion about how much funding might be available via the public sector versus how much is available through those private insurance companies. And unique to oncology, public funding is primarily available for oncology products, although there are some private insurance coverage opportunities. And public funding is also available for any treatments administered in public hospitals, and these are just a couple of small examples. So with that, the public funders and decision makers are faced with trying to figure out how to reallocate resources. And the questions that they're faced with, they're trying to balance the clinical evidence and value for a new therapy with the economic evidence and value. So the key questions for those payers in the public system, those public drug programs, are how can we ensure public funds are allocated or directed to where there will be the greatest benefit? Who has a responsibility and accountability to make that decision? And finally, what processes are in place to support decision making? So we'll start to walk through that a little bit now. Now, everyone's probably familiar with Health Canada. Health Canada is the regulator, whereas we also have the Health Technology Assessment Agencies, or HTA. And in Canada, we have CADTH, which is the National Health Technology Assessment Agency that includes all provinces with the exception of Quebec. INES is the Health Technology Assessment Agency in Quebec. And then we have the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which is a national collective negotiation body of provincial jurisdictions. So that's the negotiation body of the public payers. Most recently, there's been a lot of information in the press about the Patented Medicines Pricing Review Board, and they're the federal government pricing regulator. So what are these agencies' objectives? So Health Canada objectives, just to be clear, the questions that Health Canada tries to address with their evaluations of new products is, does this treatment work, and is it safe for human use? So for example, the agency looks at the overall summary of the quality of information that's presented, the quality with respect to manufacturing, the chemistry, etc. And there's a critical assessment of the clinical data that's part of the total clinical package. On the other hand, the Health Technology Assessment Agency objectives are, what does that evidence say? What does that clinical data say in the way of evidence in the context of existing agents that are currently available? How does this treatment compare to existing agents to treat this condition? Or if there's no existing agent, how does it compare to the standard of care? So the agency's objectives are really on, what is that comparative clinical effectiveness? And to do that, typically manufacturers are required to submit evidence on head-to-head comparison trials. So these are phase 3 trials. And what they want to understand is, what's the data and the evidence that supports this new product versus what's currently available. The final element that HTA agencies evaluate is the economic value in the context of those existing agents that are available. Now, here's a bit of the process flow that happens with health technology assessment. So manufacturers typically are required to submit documentation to CADTH and INES, and the timing for that may or may not be aligned with the Health Canada submission. So there is opportunity to submit at the same time, but the timing for that is determined typically by multiple factors. And then there's an opportunity between the manufacturer's submission and the final recommendation being published by the HTA agencies for formalized patient and clinician input. Ultimately, the final recommendation will include that patient and clinician input. Historically at CADTH, the patient input was summarized in the final recommendation documentation. But most recently, the full patient input submission documentation is actually published. And then the recommendation comes from those HTA agencies and goes to the provincial jurisdictions, who make decisions to list or not to list based on the recommendation, and engage with the manufacturers for what's commonly known as letters of intent, and ultimately product listing agreements with each individual province. So here's a bit of a summary of some of the challenges that have been observed with HTA reviews for new therapies in the context of trying to appreciate that balance between the clinical value propositions and the economic value that's at the table. There's been a greater focus most recently on the introduction of new therapies for diseases where previously there was no cure. So those diseases have complex disease physiologies, complex biology, there may be a genetic influence. So there's multifactorial elements that go into the deliberations and the analysis of the evidence. Typically too, in some of these trials, especially if there are rare disease trials, there are small patient numbers, and the evidence that's generated may not be generalizable to a broader population. These trials also take time to execute and implement and often require global enrollment. With that makes the trials costly to run and also complex and fairly costly to implement. One of the other challenges is that the comparators may not exist. So we may be looking at this new therapy in an area where standard of care might be palliation only, or it may be compassionate care. Or if they are not available, if there are other comparators available, they may be available somewhere else in the world, but they're not available in Canada. The final piece on that focus is that the standard of care could be different across the world. We're all interested in scientific advancements and greater complexity, but with this brings added complexity for evaluating these new therapies. And some examples where this has been challenging have been in the area of gene therapy, combination products versus single medicines, which you would be familiar with in oncology. Specialized testing might be required that necessitates a change in the publicly funded healthcare system to implement new tests or to implement a broader spectrum of tests that previously weren't available. And further, there could be complexity with manufacturing processes, with storage, for example, that products need to be stored in refrigerators, including for transportation for where the product's going to be administered. And finally, there might be administration complexities associated with not only administering the product, but any pre-treatment medications that need to be provided, and post-treatment monitoring as well, which you would also be familiar with in oncology. And finally, the demonstration of that economic value is critical to the success. So just a reminder, value is not equal to price, and this is a definition from the Oxford Dictionary, that the value is how much something is worth in money or other goods for which it can be exchanged. And once that value is determined by the HTA agencies, the next question is, can the public payer now afford to buy this product? Can they afford to list it on their provincial formularies? And this is where the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance activity gets started. So some of the sticking points that have been observed with HTA reviews, and these are my observations, some of the challenges and some of the sticking points that have resulted in lengthier times for reviews and ultimate recommendation decisions. Sometimes there are novel clinical trial designs. This requires new skills for the reviewers to evaluate the clinical and economic evidence. And in oncology, this has been observed with the design of basket trials, umbrella or platform trials, especially in those for those products in oncology that are tumor agnostic. Or there might be phase 2 trial data only, where phase 3 is not feasible or ethical. So ultimately, there's no comparator arm. The next big bucket of sticking points is the clinical benefit may be difficult to evaluate. So there's no comparison to the existing standard of care or treatments in comparison to this new product. Or there's uncertainty in the interpretation of clinical outcomes and generalizability of those outcomes and findings to the broader population. The last two sticking points with HTA reviews, which are critical to remind us all of during this webinar, is the alignment of clinician and patient input. The need for a new treatment and the desire by the patient or clinical community for a new therapy may not actually align with the evidence that's available. So for example, if there's a desire by those communities for a cure, but the clinical evidence does not suggest that this new therapy will address the cure, there's a misalignment there. The other sticking point is that economic value is uncertain. So manufacturers are required to submit very complex economic documentation, including whether or not the introduction of a new therapy might offset costs associated with the current standard of care. And some of that data that might be required may not be readily accessible. So this could be things like hospitalization costs or fees for certain tests or certain procedures, or certain surgical activities. And then the cost per quality adjusted life year threshold is an instrument or a tool used by the HTA agencies which permits the evaluation of the product using a benchmark against which the cost effectiveness is evaluated. And there's a fair bit of discussion, debate about whether or not that may or may not be appropriate. And that threshold in Canada sometimes is different from the threshold in other countries. How can these be avoided or dislodged, these 6 sticking points that we just spoke about? The successful outcomes are typically observed when there's clarity on the clinical value of the therapy and clarity for the decision maker on the patient population that would most benefit. So this includes that there's a rationale clearly explained for why a clinical trial was designed a certain way, including the choice of endpoints in the trial, the size of the study population, and the clinically meaningful and statistical significance of findings. So not only are findings statistically significant, but they're clinically meaningful for the community that's going to benefit the most. And typically that's a requirement of the manufacturer to address that first element. And then another piece of clarification is on the articulation of the gaps in the current treatment paradigm, and how does this new treatment fulfill this gap? So it's important to clearly articulate for the reviewers and decision makers that what we currently have in place today in the way of treatment options are lacking, and a new treatment will fulfill that gap. And more importantly, and this is why this is highlighted, is that there's an alignment between the existing evidence for the new therapy, the clinician, and the patient expectations for the new treatment. The second piece is that that sticking points can be avoided when there has been clinician and patient engagement in those input processes. There have been several files I've noted where there has not been either clinician or a combination thereof engagement into those input processes. And we'll talk a little bit more about those input processes in a moment. And finally, the sticking points can be avoided or dislodged if there's a credible and compelling economic value proposition in light of the existing evidence that's available. So our HTA agencies actually encourage and have been modifying processes that support patient input into the decision making, and there's a fair bit of guidance for that. So I put a link here to the patient and input feedback documentation and guidance that's available at CADIF, as well as the questionnaire that's available for patients and caregivers at INESS, and I encourage everyone to be familiar with that. The overall goals with this input process and for formalizing it according to CADIF is to increase the transparency, accountability, and credibility of the recommendations that they make. So here's a summary of some of the reasons and the rationale for why CADIF would like to have input from patients. This provides the context for the decision makers with the goal of improving the quality of the decision making. Remember, these reviewers and decision makers are not expert in every therapeutic area or every disease area. And so appreciating and understanding the context from a patient perspective in that space serves to highlight and to prepare them for the subsequent deliberations and review of the packages. This input also educates the reviewers about the impact of living with the disease and the current treatment options, including the caregiver experience. Furthermore, the patient input identifies the health outcomes that are important to patients and their families, outcomes that matter, and whether or not these align with the clinical trial outcomes. It also assists the reviewers with identifying the lack of treatment options in Canada or care gaps in disease management. And finally, the patient input supports the understanding of potential implementation issues for patients. So for example, if there is a therapy that's available, but it necessitates travel to a treatment center far from home several times a month, as opposed to a new therapy with new evidence, that necessitates less frequent travel, that's an important piece for CADTH and the reviewers to understand. Also, if there are several pre-treatment medications that are expected to be given in the cancer treatment center, for example, and that requires the patient to be in the cancer center for all day, as well as for a family member to take a day off work, those are important things for the reviewers to understand. So the implementation issues all relate to how this impacts patients and their families, and if they didn't have this new therapy in place, what could the potential negative impact of that be? Now remember that the payers and the HTA reviewers are thinking about public funding and resource allocations. So the clinical evidence and value imbalance with the evidence, economic evidence and value are the focus for the deliberations. So here are some observations on critical success factors that help with successful and unsuccessful outcomes. Again, the top three: clarity on the clinical evidence and the suitable patient population. The economic value is credible and can be justified. And remember, value is just not about price. The clinical value from a patient and clinician perspective align with the available evidence for the new therapy. And that supports the balancing of that clinical evidence and the economic evidence. Unsuccessful outcomes, unfortunately, the observations there have been when the clinical value is actually not clear and the reports articulate that, or it's not recognized because there's significant uncertainty. That lack of clinical uncertainty ultimately leads to economic value uncertainty, which poses challenges for a positive HTA recommendation, or if there is a recommendation, it could be quite a complex decision with multiple criteria, etc. This ultimately results in delays in decision-making and ultimately negotiations with provincial jurisdictions through the PCPA, and sadly and ultimately delays in access for patients who could potentially benefit from this new treatment. And that's the end of my presentation, Trevor. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for your presentation. That was quite amazing. If there's anyone who has questions below, there's a question tab on the side that you can definitely look to see this. I was going to say that there are seems to be a lot of the challenges whenever it comes to implementing HTA and these. It seems that in our kind of view of things that the winds have almost shifted in that patient voices are really starting to be valued in this kind of HTA and in general. And do you believe that there at any point was a tipping point that we can point to, or that where more patient voices were there, or was there more of a general kind of acceptance that patients need to be part of this process in general?
I believe it's been an evolutionary process. You'll recall historically the agencies did not receive patient input at all, and then there was an opportunity for patient input through formal documentation, but that input was summarized in documents. And most recently, the full publication of that full patient input documentation is published. And it's been commented in the public domain by CADTH that when they start and sit down to start looking at the evidence, there's actually a discussion about what the patient input content has been, just to set the stage and provide context for the subsequent discussion. So I think that the patient input importance of it has evolved. I think it's never more critical than it is now. Especially with some of these more complex therapies coming, and the complexity in cancer care is evolving too. It's not a one-size-fits-all anymore. There's specialized medicine coming, there's precision medicine coming, and it's critical that the patient input is organized and completed wherever there are opportunities to do that, to support those decision makers in their deliberations.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the main things that a lot of people come across and actually this was in the news recently, that CBC was talking about how some patients were going overseas, in the specific case of Germany, for a certain cancer treatment. And part of all the arguments are that, well, as you said, there's an economic argument that we can't bring this to Canada for just those kind of economy of scale reasons, and a whole bunch of other things. And I was wondering if there is anything in HTA that allows for patients to go abroad, or making that process simpler for these kind of treatments that are life-saving but haven't been necessarily approved by Health Canada.
So just to take a step back, the HTA agencies do not pay for therapies. They make recommendations for decision makers who might decide to pay or not for some therapies. That's an important piece to understand. And if there is opportunity to receive a treatment out of country, there are some provinces that have out of country application processes if it's deemed that a patient could benefit from that treatment. The challenge for the reviews of those out of country applications sometimes is that the evidence has not been reviewed in Canada, either at a Health Canada level or at the HTA agency level. So the onus really is on the clinician who wishes to treat that patient to navigate that out of country process at the various provinces. Mm-hmm. The timing for bringing that potential new therapy to Canada is highly variable, depending on the manufacturer's priorities for countries. As you can appreciate, manufacturers deliberate on where their priority countries are going to be based on regulatory reasons, HTA reasons, supply, complexity of administration, et cetera. There's a whole bunch of factors that shape a manufacturer's decision about the timing for coming into various countries. So one thing I encourage my manufacturer clients is to utilize the alignment process between Health Canada and the HTA agencies to minimize the gap between when the submission documentation is in, and to facilitate swifter decision making. Because if you've got Health Canada's decision coming out at around the same time as an HTA recommendation, then that shortens the time to get to the negotiation table.
Mm-hmm. Now, a quick request from Elaine. She is requesting to see the slide on showing the health budget spent on doctors versus therapy and medicine. Mm-hmm. And as she has time to read that, Scott asks, in terms of treatment gaps, do you know about if they are decided democratically with patient input, or do they come from top-down pharmaceuticals to patients?
The treatment gaps that are addressed as part of the HTA reviews are typically identified by clinicians and the patient input processes. So manufacturers also can articulate that treatment gap with any other supporting evidence that might suggest, for example, if patients are receiving a particular chemotherapy and there's either no response or a lack of an effective response, or progression-free survival is very short, then the manufacturer can use that as part of their submission documentation as well. But everything has to be evidence-based from the manufacturer, and anecdotal discussion or deliberation is typically not accepted.
And one, final question, would be, what can patients do to have more of a say in this kind of process?
Well, formally, the patient input process documentation, I'm not sure if your audience is familiar with that, but that documentation that's published on the CADTH website has been updated quite recently, and I would encourage everyone to use that because it provides very clear guidance on how to prepare for that patient input discussion and deliberation. And if there are patient advocacy organizations associated with the disease area, it's typically helpful to have those formalized groups submit the data as part of the patient input content for that.
Excellent.
This is the slide. I think you're Elaine, I think it was, that was
Yes,
interested.
Elaine says thanks for showing that slide, and it's
Yeah.
very important to kind of know because there's been a lot of questions recently about that public-private split in
Okay. So
in a
just to
law.
be, yeah, and for clarity, that public-private split varies by therapeutic area, if you can imagine. So let's take a situation, let's take a therapeutic area like migraine. So a lot of migraine sufferers are typically the working population. So that would be a high proportion of private to public split because people who work and have eligible health benefits through their employer typically would have private insurance. On the flip side, treatments for things like Alzheimer's disease, the public-private split balance would be significantly different because you're not typically talking about the working population there, right? You're talking about the elderly who typically don't have private insurance coverage. So it's highly variable depending on the therapeutic area.
Excellent. Well, thank you. Oh, Francis, do you see the value of expanding the economic assessments to capture beyond healthcare payer perspective to include, for example, out-of-pocket costs, productivity loss, caregiver burden? If so, how do we build strong evidence to be able to include in economic evaluations?
Yeah, so in fact, the examples that I provided were simply a couple of examples, but absolutely caregiver cost, caregiver burden are definitely part of that economic submission documentation that manufacturers typically present. Workplace productivity is also included in those submission documents. I would say on the private insurance side, workplace issues, workplace productivity, or loss of work days generally resonates a lot, and there's a lot of discussion at those tables when manufacturers meet with private insurance companies. But both health technology assessment agencies most definitely are interested in understanding the full economic picture for bringing a new therapy in, and if that new therapy is going to have any economic implementation challenges or positive benefits within the Canadian healthcare system overall.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Lorraine. It was a very informative talk, and thank you to everyone who posted a question. Now, this is one in a series of webinars that we're presenting this fall. Our next one actually is happening next week. So to stay in the loop about webinars, check out our website and check your email for our e-blast. If you're not seeing it in your email, we do have a third-party email service. So if you are wanting to stay into the loop, check your spam folder, or if not, you may have been unsubscribed without your knowing. So just head on over back into our website and you can find the process to subscribe to our newsletter. And make sure that you are subscribed because that's where we have everything that we're doing, from our own submissions to new websites and new programs that we're doing, as well as our webinar series. All the webinars can be found at survivornet.ca/webinar or on CCSN's YouTube channel. And if you would like, please subscribe to our YouTube channel. We update it quite regularly, especially in the fall. So thank you to Lorraine, and thank you to everyone who participated in this webinar. Have a good afternoon.
Thank you, Trevor.